The House Oversight Committee room was packed, the tension so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. The hearing had already drawn national attention, with Senator JD Vance expected to grill Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett over recent progressive legislation concerning police accountability and tech regulation. JD Vance sat forward in his seat, a subtle smirk playing at the edge of his lips. He adjusted his microphone and leaned in. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice calm but pointed, "can you explain how your proposed legislation doesn't just amount to a dangerous overreach, a federal power grab under the guise of reform?" Murmurs rose across the chamber. Cameras panned to Jasmine Crockett as she calmly straightened her blazer. She didn't flinch. Her face was unreadable, a mixture of focus, confidence, and the weight of 100 such battles. She clicked her microphone on. "Senator Vance," she began, voice even and deliberate, "it's not a power grab when the people demand protection. It's accountability when no one else is stepping up." JD raised his eyebrows slightly, clearly not expecting such a swift response. But Crockett wasn't done. She continued, voice growing stronger. "You call it overreach. I call it a correction. A correction to systems that have failed Americans, not for months, not for years, but for generations." The murmurs in the chamber became louder. Outside, on social media, her words were already going viral. Senator Vance tilted his head, clearly caught off guard by the force behind Jasmine Crockett's words. For a moment, the room was silent, a rare stillness in a political chamber usually buzzing with side chatter and strategic whispers. Crockett kept going. "You know what real overreach looks like?" she asked, eyes locked on Vance. "It looks like politicians sitting comfortably in Washington while families in their districts can't afford clean water or basic healthcare. It looks like protecting billion-dollar corporations while ignoring the cries of working people who are just trying to make it to Friday." The smirk faded from Vance's face. She tapped the stack of reports in front of her, statistics, testimonials, signed affidavits, the receipts, as she called them. "You want to talk about dangerous?" Crockett leaned forward. "Dangerous is pretending reform is the problem when the real threat is inaction." A low rumble of agreement came from behind her, aides, a few committee members, even members of the press. The momentum was shifting, and everyone could feel it. JD Vance cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, I think you're intentionally mischaracterizing my concern," but Crockett raised one hand calmly. "No, Senator. I'm addressing what your concern actually represents, a fear of disruption. A fear that the status quo might not protect the same people it used to." And with that, she sat back, her eyes never leaving him. The air in the room was electric. Outside, cable news anchors began cutting in with breaking developments. Inside, JD Vance blinked, unsure how to proceed. JD Vance shuffled his papers, trying to regain composure. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sign he knew he was losing control of the narrative. "Well, Congresswoman," he said, "you speak of disruption as if it's always a good thing. But tearing down long-standing systems without a viable replacement doesn't solve anything. It creates chaos." Crockett didn't hesitate. "What we have now is chaos, Senator," she replied sharply. "But it's not the kind that makes headlines. It's the quiet chaos of eviction notices, closed rural hospitals, and underfunded schools. It's the kind people like you have the luxury to ignore until election season." The room stirred again. JD's eyes narrowed. "And what would you replace it with? More federal bureaucracy? More spending?" Jasmine's tone was calm but resolute. "More accountability. More transparency. More investment in people, not profits. The question isn't whether we can afford it, it's whether we can afford not to." A pause lingered after her words. Cameras captured the moment, her hands folded calmly, her expression unwavering, while Vance shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of every eye watching. Behind the scenes, a Democratic aide whispered to a colleague, "She just buried him," and handed him a folded flag. On Twitter, her words were trending under hashtag Crockett clapback. But inside the room, it wasn't about trending. It was about truth. And Jasmine Crockett had just spoken it loud enough for the nation to hear. Outside the chamber, networks scrambled. MSNBC cut into scheduled programming. CNN queued up highlights. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the buzz. Jasmine Crockett had taken the floor, and the floor wasn't taking her back. Inside, JD Vance adjusted his tie, visibly rattled now. He turned his tone down, trying to salvage ground. "Well, perhaps I should review those amendments more closely," he muttered, a half concession, half deflection. Crockett nodded slowly, her eyes steady. "I hope you do, Senator. Because the stakes aren't hypothetical for the people we represent." She reached into her folder and held up a single photo, a worn image of a young woman and her child outside a shuttered clinic in rural Arkansas. "This mother couldn't wait for political timing," Crockett said, her voice dipping into something raw. "Her child didn't have the luxury of delay. That clinic closed because funding dried up, and no one stood up in time." A wave of silence washed over the room. No one expected her to bring the human element so directly into focus. Crockett didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She placed the photo down and continued, "You say reform is chaos. No. Neglect is chaos. And it looks like that photo every single day in this country." JD Vance leaned back in his chair, defeated not by aggression, but by precision. He wasn't just out-argued, he'd been outclassed. Jasmine Crockett gave a nod, not to him, but to the record. "Let the transcript reflect," she said softly, "that Clarity walked into this room today and didn't ask permission to speak." The chair finally cleared their throat, visibly unsure how to transition. We'll recess for 10 minutes. But the moment wasn't recessing. It was rising, replayed in headlines, shared across feeds, and quoted by anchors. And in that moment, it became clear, the nation hadn't just listened. It had heard her. The 10-minute recess turned into 30. Staffers hustled in and out of the chamber, whispering furiously into phones. Journalists outside the Capitol were broadcasting live with stunned expressions. And inside, JD Vance sat quietly, eyes fixed on the polished table in front of him, no more notes, no more smirk. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, didn't retreat to a back room. She remained seated, calm, composed, surrounded by a few quiet allies who offered nods and respectful silence. No grandstanding. Just presence, powerful, unshaken presence. A young staffer walked by and whispered, "You broke the internet." She gave a small smile. "Not the goal," she replied. "But I'll take it if it means they're finally listening." By the time the hearing resumed, the energy had shifted permanently. The chair tapped the gavel. "We will resume questioning," but the room was no longer Vance's. It belonged to the narrative that had just unfolded, a narrative of voice over volume, of truth over theater. Crockett didn't need to say anything more. She had already done what many try to do in Washington their whole careers, make the room stop and think. A reporter tweeted, "Crockett didn't just shut down Vance, she rewrote the tone of the entire hearing." A few desks down, a conservative analyst murmured into a hot mic, "If that's the future of political debate." Vance just ran into it headfirst. When the session finally closed, and representatives began filing out, Jasmine gathered her notes without fanfare. But as she stood, the gallery erupted, not in applause, but in something quieter, more powerful. Respect. And somewhere, behind the cameras and commentary, a young black girl watching at home turned to her mother and whispered, "I want to speak like her one day." By nightfall, Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere. Clips of her exchange with JD Vance dominated every major news outlet. One commentator called it, "the most decisive moment in a congressional hearing all year." Hashtags like hashtag Crockett commanded and hashtag powerful words surged across platforms. But for Crockett, it wasn't about the spotlight, it was about the substance. That evening, She appeared on a late political roundtable, her posture relaxed, but her tone still focused. "I didn't go in there today to shut someone down," she said. "I went in to stand up. Stand up for people who never get invited into those rooms, who never get asked what they need. That seat I hold, it's theirs. I just happen to be in it." The panel fell silent. Even critics nodded, unable to argue with that. Back in Ohio, JD Vance's office released a brief statement. "While today's exchange was spirited, I appreciate the Congresswoman's passion and commitment to her constituents. I look forward to further discussion on these vital issues." But inside his team, there was damage control. Donors were asking questions. Constituents were calling in. And some weren't happy with how it all went down. Meanwhile, Jasmine's team worked through the night. Emails poured in, not from lobbyists, but from teachers, nurses, students, single moms, and retired factory workers. Many of them had never written a member of Congress before. One message simply read, "I didn't think anyone in D.C. spoke like we do. Until today. Thank you." Jasmine sat with that one for a long time. She hadn't gone viral. She had gone visible. And when voices become visible, especially ones the system tries to sideline, something fundamental starts to shift. The days that followed weren't just about media coverage, they were about momentum. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's words were played in classrooms, town halls, and union meetings. Community organizers began quoting her in speeches. A university professor in Atlanta built an entire lecture around the rhetorical structure of her response to JD Vance. She had become more than a viral moment, she had become a reference point. Inside Capitol Hill, something else began to stir. Colleagues who once saw Crockett as a rising voice now saw her as a force to be reckoned with. Junior legislators began approaching her, asking for guidance, insight, or simply the courage to speak as plainly as she had. Even a few unexpected voices reached out. A Republican staffer sent a private message, "We don't agree on much." But that was leadership. "I wish more people around here spoke with that kind of spine." Jasmine responded with nothing more than a "thank you. Let's build something better." But not everyone was thrilled. A few conservative commentators tried to reframe the moment, suggesting she had been disrespectful, too assertive, or grandstanding for cameras. Crockett didn't respond directly. Instead, she hosted a virtual town hall that Friday. No filters. No spin. Just her and the people. She answered every question, from rural broadband to police reform, from school lunch programs to veterans benefits. Over 50,000 people tuned in. And in closing, she said, "This isn't about me versus anyone. This is about truth versus comfort. And I promise you, I'm never going to choose comfort." That line hit like a bell. By the next morning, grassroots donations had doubled. Her press secretary's phone didn't stop ringing. And most importantly, communities that had felt unheard, especially Black, brown, working class, and rural voices, suddenly felt seen. A spark had become a current. And a current, if carried with care, could become a movement. Inside the Capitol, the tone had changed. In backroom meetings where policy was usually diluted and softened, Jasmine Crockett now sat at the table, and people listened. Her presence commanded attention not through volume, but through precision. She didn't bluff. She didn't stall. She brought facts, names, and the kind of clarity that couldn't be filibustered. Senior lawmakers who once dismissed her as too new or too bold were now requesting joint legislation meetings. Some even asked her to help them frame their own messaging. She wasn't just shaping debates, she was shaping direction. Meanwhile, JD Vance kept a low profile. His usual cable appearances were quietly cancelled. He released a generic op-ed about partisan decorum, but it landed flat. The public had already chosen the moment they remembered, and it wasn't his. One of his advisors reportedly said in frustration, "He brought a script. She brought the truth." That weekend, Jasmine was invited to speak at a bipartisan youth leadership summit in Chicago. She stood before a crowd of high school and college students, many of whom had never attended a political event in their lives. Their signs read, "Your voice is our voice. Speak loud. Stand firm. Jasmine equals justice." But Jasmine wasn't there to bask in praise. She opened her speech with a challenge. If what happened last week inspired you, good. But if all it does is live in your phone as a clip, we've failed. Real change doesn't go viral. It shows up. It organizes. It votes. It holds people accountable even after the cameras stop rolling. Silence. Then applause, long, rising, thunderous. And somewhere backstage, a veteran activist who'd marched in the 60s turned to his granddaughter and whispered, "That's what legacy looks like." Weeks passed, but the moment never faded. It evolved. What began as a sharp exchange between two lawmakers had grown into something far larger, a blueprint for how courage, clarity, and conviction could break through the noise of American politics. Jasmine Crockett didn't slow down. She introduced two new bills, one focused on protecting rural healthcare infrastructure, the other on expanding civic education in underserved school districts. Both were co-sponsored by lawmakers across party lines. That alone made headlines. Meanwhile, JD Vance avoided further direct confrontation, but his team quietly made policy adjustments, echoing some of the very reforms he had scoffed at during that now infamous hearing. Back home in her district, Jasmine was greeted with signs, murals, and standing-room-only town halls. But she kept her message grounded. "Don't make this about me," she'd say. "Make it about the people we fight for." Her words had done more than silence a political opponent. They'd shifted what people expected from their leaders. No more empty performances. No more vague promises. Jasmine Crockett had shown the nation what it looked like when someone came to Congress not to play politics, but to protect people. And in doing so, she left behind not just a moment, but a mark. A voice that didn't echo through the Capitol. It changed it.